खेती कर सकते हैं, ऐसा हमें लगता है।
समझो बाहर से अगर कोई मार्गदर्शन नहीं करेगा तो ये सब चीजें तो हो ही नहीं सकती। अभी ये नाबार्ड वाले तो बहुत सारा मार्गदर्शन करते हैं, इसकी वजह से बहुत सारा बदलाव आया है। और इधर के पंचायत समिति की तरफ से कृषि का भी जो कृषि दिंडी का आयोजन होता है उसमें भी बहुत सारा मार्गदर्शन किया जाता है।
बाहर जाने की जरूरत नहीं, केंद्र सरकार दुनिया की योजनाएं चला रही कि अब घरेलू में जहाँ का निवासी वही काम करे। अब यहाँ अपने काम आ नहीं रहे, कहाँ तक एक पंचायत में कितने काम करवा, 150 आदमी लग जाएंगे और यहाँ 3000 की आबादी है।
97 में जो काम हो गया ना इसका वाटर शेड का, इससे वो पानी बढ़ गया और खेती में अनाज का ज्यादा बढ़ गया, प्याज टमाटर इसके पीछे गवाई सब कुछ बढ़ गया और पब्लिक को भी मजदूरी मिल गई।
अगर 2 मीटर का टॉप डैम बन जाए तो 3 किलोमीटर ऊपर तक पानी बिल्कुल लेवल हो जाएगा। 4 से 8 गाँव इस तरफ की, 4 से 8 गाँव इस तरफ की बिल्कुल खाली हो, जल से जो भरपूर हो जाएगा। अन्न भी उनके पास उपार्जन होगा बहुत अच्छा, जल भी होगा, जल के स्रोत भी बढ़ेंगे।
खेती में तो महंगाई बढ़ी है नहीं, बहुत होगा। डीजल लिया तो बहुत हो गया, अपन कमीज बढ़े। बिजली नहीं है तो पंप सेट चलाएंगे डीजल वाला, तो डीजल से चलाएंगे, उससे थोड़ा महंगा पड़ेगा वो।
या 300 रुपया 500 रुपया ज्यादा से ज्यादा मानो बीघा में खर्च होनी, इलेक्ट्रिक खर्च आते।
मिस्त्री आदमी ये बन जाएगा, मोटर बना बांधना करना ये तो आम बात है, सीखने की बात है, जो सीख लेते हैं। मगर जो जाए या चीज नहीं मिलती वो कैसे मिले? यहाँ
కరెంటు 9 గంటలు ఇస్తాను, కరెంటు 7 గంటలకే వచ్చింది. ఆ వచ్చిన 7 గంటల కూడా మాకు సరిగా అందడం లేదు. మధ్య మధ్యలో ఉయ్యలు తెగిపోవడం కానీ, ట్రాన్స్ఫారాలు 3 రోజులకు ఒకసారి కాలిపోవడం కానీ ఇటువంటివి మాకు జరగడం వల్ల పంట నష్టం జరుగుతుంది.
केरोसिन भी 3 लीटर मिलता है जो महीने भर में उनका संचालन होता नहीं है। उजाले के लिए अगर लाइट की थोड़ी व्यवस्था हो जाए और कहीं किसी से मदद मिल जाए तो बच्चों के लिए ये फायदे लायक चीज है।
अपा से पानी जो जहाटा नहीं होने वाला है और लाइट हो गए तो मोटर फिट कह रहा हूँ
नहीं, कमियां तो है। कमियां ये है कि जो काम वो कर रहे हैं वो करने के बाद उसकी तरफ उनकी तरफ ध्यान रख रखाव ध्यान नहीं दे रहे अपन।
नरेगा में सबसे ज्यादा आदमी परेशान इसलिए कि उसका समय पर भुगतान नहीं होता रहा। ठीक है, 1-1 महीना तक पेमेंट नहीं मिलेगा। आज सब ने वैल्यूएशन नहीं चढ़ाया तो कल उन्होंने भुगतान पर्ची नहीं बनाई तो परसों वहाँ से मास्टर इशू नहीं हुआ, फिर 2 दिन बैंक वालों ने टरका दिया। ये सब बातें तो मजदूर आदमी 1 महीने तक कैसे मान जाएगा जो अपने पेट के लिए खुद बैठा है। तो
100 दिन काम करा तो उसमें उसको 10,000 की इनकम होती, 100 रुपए के हिसाब से, तो कभी 5,000 लोगों को मिलते। 5,000 तो छठोड़ी होते, 60 करते हैं छुट्टी।
वो ये कि जो एक ही क्रॉप लेते हैं, बारिश के ऊपर जो क्रॉप आता है जो भाग का वही लेती है, लेकिन 4-6 महीने के लिए डबल क्रॉप लेने के लिए इधर कुछ ये नहीं, इसलिए वो उसकी यही अपेक्षा है कि वो हमें सिंचाई व्यवस्था हो खेती के लिए।
सब है, पानी की व्यवस्था से सब कम गिरा हुआ जो है, जो पानी ही है पानी। हाँ ये बात है।
Thank you. Next on the agenda is a very, very short presentation that we'd like to make about the Chennai Action Plan, it being the culmination of 10 months of work done and a fairly elaborate consultative process. If I could have the presentation up, please. The 2-pager should be with you or will be with you shortly in case you haven't got a copy yet. I just thought it might be useful before our panelists deliberate on various issues that we run through the essence of the action plan. There were wide-ranging consultations involving participants from various sectors or, if you like, walks of society, from organizations that work at the grassroots to those who work at the international level, and a number of partners, as you can see, were involved. The idea being to link the voices that were emanating from the ground into a process that would reach the policy platform. The preamble essentially talks about connecting the voices of grassroots communities into policy dialogue, the fact that it has to be driven by a process that's people-centric, people-led, and that holistic ecosystem resilience would be a guiding principle. There were a number of areas in which deliberations took place. Food security emerged as perhaps the most critical, along with water. And there is a section, therefore, on what are now referred to as smart water policies, followed by clean and efficient energy in its various forms, from household cooking and lighting solutions for village households, right up to national energy policy and its criticality. A very strong view was taken of climate risk management and how we could mainstream this in all processes that take place, particularly those which are led by the government at various levels, national, state, district, and even amongst Panchayati Raj institutions. And then special mention has been made of reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. In terms of cross-cutting measures that the consultations threw up as being critical in terms of our effort to adapt to climate change and also promote mitigation measures, interactions between field and laboratory were felt to be very important. Education extension services, insurance, an area that we haven't touched upon today but might want to. Then the National Eco-Technology Mechanism being proposed as a way of accelerating the development and the transfer of climate resilient technology. The need to establish financial mechanisms which provide additional and scaled up finance, and then last but not the least, the setting up of measurable targets and appropriate monitoring and reporting mechanisms. With that brief summary of the Climate Action Plan, it's now my pleasure to hand the conduct of this session over to Nitin Sethi. Nitin Sethi is a noted journalist, active in various forms of media, working primarily with the Times of India. Nitin, could I hand over to you? Thank you very much.
Thanks. I thought we could start with introducing our panel today, and then, being a journalist, I could ask leading questions of them without giving them too much space, hopefully, and then open the floor after 5 minutes from each of the panelists, then open the floor to come up with questions, ideas, statements, whatever they want to make. Start off on the extreme left, Dr. Abhijit Sen, member of the Planning Commission and a noted economist, what a friend of mine called the constructive critique within the Planning Commission, embodied in him. He's also particularly committed to issues of poverty reduction and concerns about public goods and how they're taken care of in terms of pure economics in macro and micro issues. Next to me, Dr. N.K. Singh, member of the Parliament now, been part of the IAS service earlier, has again contributed a lot to the way the economic policies have moved in our country, and has been also part of the Bihar politics now. So also playing his hand at the regional level today. Therefore might have a perspective which is also rooted from a state rather than sitting at Delhi and saying what needs to be done at the state level. To my right, Dr. Jagdish Keshwan, India's foremost negotiator on forestry issues when it comes to climate. He's almost single-handedly written the entire forestry related policies that are now being discussed as RED or RED Plus. Not really needing too much of a introduction, Dr. Ashok Khosla, Chairman of Development Alternatives, one of the pioneering individuals who did work on technologies and advancing green technology long before I even knew DA existed, so I shouldn't be introducing him much, and is recipient of the Saskava Award in 2002. Next to him on the extreme right, I apologize, is Professor R.B. Singh, advisor of the IFCO Foundation, member of the National Commission on Farmers, and has spent 18 years with the Food and Agriculture Organization before this. He's Assistant Director General and Regional Representative. If I could shoot off, I'd taken a early look at the Chennai action plan and thought I could hopefully provoke the members on the panel on a few issues. If I could start with Dr. Abhijit Sen, and two things I thought if you could help us understand. While we are talking of food security here in a larger principle-based manner, there's already in process right now the Food Security Act, which has already taken a certain shape, if not detailed out, but at least the canvas is there. There is large debate about it, and the way the government works, once the inertia over the act is over, it will be difficult to have something amending that in the long run. That will kind of set the tablet for how food security is looked upon, at least at a national level. Now, how do you see that and the concerns about use of new biotechnology, new technologies, integrate? I also see that the Chennai Action Plan specifically refers in its draft up to small-scale farmers. Now, how do you see the small-scale farmers in the next 10, 15 years? How do you see large business in agriculture as well at the same time playing up? And how do you figure that the Food Security Act, how much of the concerns that are raised here really get taken care of by this act? If you could have 5-10 minutes on this.
Chew on. I mean, you've thrown in a lot of things into the same basket. On the Food Security Act, I don't know what the act finally will look like. I hope it's a short act rather than too detailed an act. And I think it highlights principles, throwing details into the notifications and things of that kind. Because as you rightly said, that there is an inertia about things, and one of the things that we need to allow for is possible change, and we don't know at what space. And you talked about small-scale farmers, and the possible contradictions with large corporates. Large corporates, to some extent, have been there. Sugar sector is a good example of it. But they are and will be a pretty secondary players, certainly in terms of numbers of people in agriculture, for a fairly long time to come. Our agriculture consists mainly of people who are small, who are mainly dependent on agriculture, but we should realize that a lot of them are actually looking for other things as well. I mean, families are now not entirely agriculture to a much greater extent than before. And we clearly need to make space for the corporate sector, only keeping the interests of this vast group there. And this has implications for the Food Security Act as well, because let's not forget it. I mean that most of our consumers are in fact also producers, and I think that's one aspect that our food security needs to take into account. New technologies, biotechnology. Well, I think, there is a whole set of attitudes on certain of these which are extremely Luddite in nature, and I think we need to overcome it. But having said that, I think it's also important to realize that you need to take people along with you. And I think our regulatory agencies need to rise to that level of credibility that for some reason they did not have at the time of the BT Brinjal. But the basic issue, I think, coming back to both the theme of this dialogue as well as the questions you asked me, the important thing to realize, I think, is that the one thing we do know about climate change is that it brings greater uncertainty. And it is the ability to deal with those uncertainties which is crucial to the way we deal with the problem at present, rather than throwing things down. And the key in the agricultural sector is not the big issues of climate change. It is not so much mitigation, it is adaptation. And adaptation is something which the entire farming community continuously does. We have to help them to adapt more quickly, and we have to help them to be more secure against possible contingencies which they've never seen before, they're likely to see more frequently. And I do think that both the Food Security Act as well as new technologies do play a very great role in both of these things. I mean, in terms of one as a part of a larger insurance measure, the other as a part of adaptation, whether it be slow or relatively quick. But without going into details, these are centers, I think, of the way certainly some of us in government are proceeding.
I'll try not to put you in a spot by asking questions of what do you think of the Food Security Act in its current form. But moving on to Dr. Singh, picking up from what Dr. Sen said, there is a move within the government but looks at large subsidies again to be provided, or an increased enhanced subsidy scheme to be provided, at least for the Food Security Act. Whereas there has also been a concern about whether, as the G20 statement itself says, and it'll probably at some point flow down into climate change, energy and other subsidies, is to reduce subsidies on energy, water, perhaps food as well. Where do you see this going? Because there is an inherent contradiction. The more you want to provide a certain degree of insurance to the most vulnerable, the state does need to intervene and step in. At the same time, you do increase the role and the investments that the public sector will need to make in these areas. Is there a problem in that, or do you see this solving out?
Well, thank you, Nitin. I think let me begin by making one very preliminary observation. I do believe that the issues of mitigation, adaptation, technology, financing, and measurement into monitorable targets, there's a symbiotic relationship in all these, and it's difficult to find fixed paradigms which either can be applied to any one of them individually, or which can be applied generically to all this category. Now, I had moved a resolution in Parliament about 4 months ago, which was debated for 14 hours, for the constitution of an omnibus environment adaptation and mitigation fund, because I was quite conscious of the interrelationship which exists between different facets of our environmental policy. And before I withdrew that resolution, I had the Environment Minister, Mr. Jairam Ramesh, commit that he would be bringing a white paper during this winter session of Parliament itself on the progress which has been made on the 8 special missions constituted under the National Environmental Action Plan, and the extent to which some of these concerns really have been addressed. Now, you have asked me, Nitin, 3 very pointed questions. First of all, there is this issue on the whole agricultural food security, the extent of subsidy, and spilling over to how we intend to really handle the burden to the state exchequer when it comes to the energy security issues as well. Now, I think that it does not require really too much of an analyst to realize that our present policies, both on agriculture and on energy, remains to have a restructuring and currently suffers from very serious flaws. It suffers from flaws because as long as you have policies in which farmers are incentivized to use and harness water almost free or at negligible cost, as long as you have policies which give you free electricity, which enables you to use your pumps for pumping out water at negligible or almost free cost, there is no incentive to follow either energy efficient or water efficient modules of production. How does one alter this? I think the biggest culprit in this respect is the state itself, because we do have a very flawed policy on energy, where vast sums of money are currently going into subsidizing the use of fossil fuel in this country. The current estimates vary from about $2 to $3 billion a year. Currently is the state subsidy on subsidizing the use of fossil fuel. Now, not all of it is for agriculture, but how does one really move in a direction where growth does not get compromised and the pace of growth can be harmonized by technologies which are less dependent on fossil fuel? Technologies are expensive. There are issues of intellectual property rights. There are issues of access to this technology. There are whole issues of financing and respect. But I think that the energy efficient policies being harmonized with growth efficient strategies need in some kind of a different approach than is currently being followed. This, by the way, includes also adaptation of cropping patterns into higher productivity and yields, and Professor Swaminathan is here, who has done an enormous amount of work on this, or whether the existing cropping patterns, which are dependent on very high intensive use of fertilizers and intensive use of water, is really something which is sustainable, and how does one have food security with a different kind of a cropping pattern which is less dependent on water, less dependent on pesticides, and less dependent on fertilizers and energy than has been the paradigm in the past. And I think that as we begin to face more and more demographic pressures in the coming areas, and as parts of India really begin to look for more and more food security in terms of improving their nutritional intake of proteins, how does one really alter agricultural practices which are in consonance with India's commitment for environment? I had mentioned about the change on the energy issue. I'll mention just two more points, Nathan, before I stop there. One is the issue of, fortunately, I think that one of the things which is really to our advantage is that the big investments in infrastructure we have not yet locked in. Unlike, for instance, China, which has locked in a huge amount of investment in infrastructure already, and therefore is committed to a particular path of growth as far as their pattern of development is concerned. We have yet in the 12th and the 13th plan to take the major decision of locking in 1 to 2 or $2.5 trillion investment in infrastructure. We therefore have a better option into selecting a path of low carbon intensive technology than some of the other countries have. So what kind of an awareness and incentive program exists which can propel India into adopting a path of low carbon intensive technology than the fixed growth paradigms have taught us and then has been pursued by some of the other emerging markets? In my view, that is one important issue which needs to be resolved. Domestically speaking, Nathan, one of the critical issues of mainstreaming is the issue of financing these kind of modules. How does one look to innovative ways of financing? I think, of course, the world has taught us. The European Union has a particular model of financing this. United Kingdom has a mode of financing it. The United States has financing it. All are variant forms of some kind of a tax on carbon production and to garner resources which can then be used for research and development and into fostering economic activity patterns which are less dependent on high use of fossil fuel energy. I think that's an area on which I think an enormous amount of work needs to be done. I'll just end up with one little comment, seek your indulgence, Nitin, is that when it comes to agriculture, and coming from a state like Bihar, since Nitin had mentioned about my Bihar connections, one of the things which strikes me in Bihar's rural area is how does one seek what economists call the low-hanging fruit. As long as we do not give the Bihar rural poor ways in which to meet their energy efficient needs, to meet their cooking needs, and to meet their lighting needs without having to depend on use of fossil fuel and without having to depend, which leads to a lot of imperfect combustion leading to black carbon. I think that how to reduce black carbon, which has of course a more limited life in the atmosphere than the CO2 emission, requires a change in the cooking and in the lighting needs for India's rural economy. For an economy like Bihar, where large parts of rural Bihar has still not yet been lit up, it will require therefore an enormous amount of intervention in public policy to meet their cooking needs instead of really collecting dry wood and relying on cow dung and so on and other forms of animal waste, and how to meet their needs of lighting up their homes through forms of renewable energy, moving away. And this has to be done on a very impressive and a rapid scale, because as Bihar's economy begins to catch up at growth rates which are 10 to 11%, Bihar's energy needs are likely to increase exponentially. And therefore, I think one of the areas of important public policy intervention would be for large parts of poor rural India, which has yet to make the choice, to have the choice made into meeting their basic needs through either renewable fuels or less polluting fossil fuels as a part of a policy intervention. So I think that end up by merely saying that there is a symbiotic relationship on issues of mitigation, adaptation, technology, alternative modes of financing, and of course an awareness program which enables India generally and rural India in particular to move to growth strategies which are less dependent on fossil fuel. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. Dr. Khosla, if I might take on from where Dr. Singh left, the question of the costs of technology and the costs of shifting from fossil fuel-based subsidies to cleaner technologies, regardless of what happens on the international arena, is that a viable scenario, or do you need to engage with the international negotiations, be conscious of how much of the price burden would fall on the domestic economy if you shifted towards renewable forms of energy? And where are these technologies really?
No country is an island. It's clear that what we do will have an impact on the rest of the world, and what the rest of the world does has a huge impact on us. Your question basically about whether we can go it alone or whether we need to devise our policies to be in consonance with bigger and more global requirements, I think is very much at the heart of the problem. We claim, most third world countries claim, that the industrialized North has been responsible for most of the problem and is therefore responsible for cleaning it up. The North says, well, you people are growing very fast and your populations are growing very fast, and you've got to take some responsibility. Whether this concept of responsibility makes sense or not, we're all in it together. We're all going to pay the cost of global warming, of climate change, of increased uncertainties. And I think it would be fair to say that it's not unreasonable for the South to take some of that responsibility.